The desert wind had a way of filling silence with its own voice. It whistled through broken fence posts, sighed against the dry timbers of the barn, and rattled the loose panes of the ranch house windows. For 12 years, that was the only voice Nathan Kearney had heard most nights. Alone on his spread of dusty land, he had learned to let the wind answer questions he no longer dared ask. He moved through each day with the measured rhythm of habit, feeding cattle, patching roofs, boiling beans, mending harness. No laughter, no conversation, just the whisper of memory and the ache of loss he carried like an old scar. That evening, a storm began to brew on the horizon. Heavy clouds swallowed the sunset, flattening the desert into a single sheet of grey. Nathan worked quickly, tying the barn doors against the coming squall, his boots sinking in dust that smelled of rain. Lightning flashed, so bright it seared the sky white. He turned toward the ridge beyond his corral, and froze. Figures moved there, not shadows of trees or cattle, but people, dark shapes pushing forward against the storm. His first thought was raiders. His second was ghosts. He grabbed the rifle leaning against the porch, cradled it in hands that still remembered war, and watched as the shapes grew clearer in the sheets of rain. Horses stumbled under exhausted riders. 10 in all, maybe more, their outlines jagged with weapons and dripping blankets. His stomach clenched when he saw the paint smeared across their faces, the long hair plastered to their shoulders. Apaches. They stopped at the edge of his property, silent against the pounding rain. For a moment, no one moved. The only sound was the storm snapping and rolling above. Nathan's mind spun back to a night years ago, when raiders swept across the border and left him with graves on the hill behind the ranch house. His wife. His son. He had buried them himself, hands numb, heart numb, his rifle too late to matter. And now, standing before him in the storm, were the same people, or close enough that memory couldn't tell the difference. One rider dismounted, moving with the slow grace of someone accustomed to being watched at gunpoint. He stepped closer until the firelight from Nathan's porch revealed a scar that ran from temple to jaw. His eyes were cold but steady, not the eyes of a beggar. When he spoke, his voice was roughened by rain and restraint. "We seek shelter. Nothing more." Nathan's rifle stayed trained on the man's chest. He felt the weight of the past pressing his finger against the trigger. 10 of them, one of him. If they wanted the ranch, it would be gone before dawn. And yet, the leader's tone held no threat, only exhaustion. Behind him, a child shifted in the saddle, wrapped in wet blankets, a pained whimper escaping. The storm cracked open overhead. Rain hammered the earth, bouncing from the porch boards, running in silver lines down Nathan's barrel. His jaw clenched. He could slam the door, let the desert swallow them, and carry on alone. He could. He told himself he could. But the image of that child's cry cut through his defenses like lightning through cloud. "Inside," he said finally, voice sharp. "But understand, this is my house. My rules. One wrong move, and you won't leave breathing." They filed in without argument, dripping shadows that filled his cabin with a sudden heaviness. The fire sputtered in protest as wet bodies crowded close. Nathan sat at the table, rifle still across his lap, eyes tracking each of them with the vigilance of a man who trusted nothing. The Apaches did not speak much, their words low and quick in a language he half remembered from skirmishes long ago. They produced strips of dried venison, chewing in silence when he offered beans. One of the younger men laughed when Nathan muttered about ungrateful guests. The sound startled the room, then faded into the crackle of the fire. Nathan kept his distance, but his eyes strayed to the child laid gently near the hearth. The boy's leg was twisted, swollen with fever. No one seemed to know what to do. Nathan rose, muttering curses at himself, and rummaged for the medical kit he hadn't opened in years. He cleaned the wound, bound it tight, spooned a bitter draught into the boy's mouth. The Apaches watched, stone-faced, but he felt their gaze soften by the time he finished. The storm raged on. Hours passed, marked only by the hiss of rain on the roof. Nathan dozed in his chair, rifle balanced across his knees. Every creak of the floor snapped him awake, heart pounding, hand twitching near the trigger. Whispers in Apache tongue floated through the dark. He couldn't tell if they were prayers or plans for his throat. Sweat ran cold along his spine. Restless, he stepped outside into the washed night. The storm had passed, leaving the desert drenched in silver moonlight. The air smelled of wet dust and sage. His boots sank into mud as he moved toward the corral, seeking air deep enough to quiet his pulse. That was when he saw them, horse tracks, fresh, circling the edge of his property. Not Apache prints, different hooves, heavier, more numerous. Someone had been watching waiting just beyond the storm. He crouched, tracing the marks with calloused fingers, unease spreading through his chest. Whoever they were, they hadn't come forward. Not yet. But they knew now. His ranch sheltered 10 Apaches. Nathan straightened, scanning the horizon. The desert stretched wide and empty under the pale moon, but he no longer felt alone. The stillness pressed against his ears, a silence too sharp to trust. Inside, the cabin flickered with firelight, shadows of his unwanted guests bending across the windows. He tightened his grip on the rifle and swallowed hard. Shelter was one thing. Survival, another. He stood there in the moonlight, caught between ghosts of the past and dangers gathering in the dark, and realized that by opening his door tonight, he might have just signed his own death warrant. Dawn came brittle and cold, the desert scrub glistening with beads of rain that caught the first light like scattered glass. Nathan stood on the porch, his shoulder tight with unease, his eyes fixed on the horizon. The storm had scoured the land clean, but the horse tracks remained burned into his mind. Someone had circled in the night, watching, measuring. He knew in his gut that trouble was coming, and soon. Behind him, the cabin stirred with the low rustle of voices. The Apaches moved quietly, gathering themselves after the storm, yet every word spoken reminded him that he was no longer master of silence in his own home. The first gunshot shattered the fragile calm. It echoed from the ridge beyond the corral, followed by the faint bark of a man's laughter. Nathan's pulse spiked. He recognized that sound, bounty hunters. Not soldiers, not raiders, but men who lived on blood money and preyed on desperation. Apache scalps brought good coin. So did cattle. And if they found him standing beside these 10, he'd be branded no different from them. The Apaches gathered quickly, their leader moving to Nathan's side. No words were needed, the threat was clear. More shots cracked across the distance, testing, taunting. Dust plumed near the barn door. Nathan's rifle felt heavy in his hands, but heavier still was the choice before him. He could send these people away, claim ignorance, save his ranch. But he looked at the boy still sleeping fitfully near the fire, his fevered breath shallow, and knew the truth. He had already chosen. They moved fast. Nathan led them to the barn, the one place sturdy enough to hold against an attack. The Apaches scanned the structure with sharp, efficient eyes, pointing out weaknesses in the walls, the angles of approach. Their leader gestured, his hands painting silent strategies in the air. Nathan followed, adding what he knew of rifle fire, of cover, of the way men thought when greed drove them. For the first time in years, his mind worked not in routines of survival but in rhythms of battle. Night fell heavy. Torches flickered on the ridge, bobbing like fireflies that promised only death. The bounty hunters had numbers, voices drifting in crude songs as they readied themselves. Nathan's breath came slow and steady as he crouched behind the barn door, rifle balanced on the sill. The Apaches spread themselves through shadow, bows strung, knives drawn, rifles borrowed. The air grew sharp, alive with waiting. The first rush came sudden. Horses thundered down the slope, riders whooping, rifles flashing fire in the dark. Bullets tore splinters from the barn, glass shattered in the cabin, the smell of gunpowder filled Nathan's lungs. He fired once, saw a rider pitch backward into the dirt. The Apaches moved like shadows, arrows slicing silently through the night, finding throats before shouts could rise. The barn shuddered as another wave slammed against it. Short bursts of thought replaced words. A crash of hooves. The snap of wood. The burn of smoke. Nathan's shoulder jerked as a bullet grazed him, hot pain cutting deep but not stopping him. He staggered, fell back, and an Apache hand gripped his collar, dragging him into cover. Their eyes locked for an instant, and in that gaze was no hatred, no rivalry, only shared survival. The fight stretched into hours, each moment sharp and unrelenting. The bounty hunters circled, probing, trying to break their defenses. One set the corral ablaze, flames licking skyward, painting the desert red. Nathan coughed smoke, eyes burning, yet kept firing, his hands steady as they had been in war. Around him, the Apaches struck with ruthless precision, their movements honed by years of struggle. He saw one young warrior fall, arrow snapped, chest pierced by lead, yet the others fought harder, grief fueling their fury. At last, the hunters began to falter. Bodies lay scattered near the fence line, horses screamed and bolted into the dark. The survivors cursed, pulled back, their torches dwindling as they fled into the horizon. The night fell quiet but for the hiss of fire and the rasp of weary breaths. Nathan lowered his rifle, chest heaving, his ears ringing with the silence that followed violence. The barn stank of blood and smoke. Inside, the Apaches tended their wounded in silence, their faces carved in grief. Nathan helped dig a grave at dawn. His hands blistered, back aching, yet he did not stop. They laid the fallen warrior in the earth beside the small hill where 2 crosses already stood, his wife's, his son's. Nathan lingered as the soil fell, feeling the strange weight of the gesture, as if he were knitting broken pieces of the past with every shovelful of dirt. When the work was done, he stood apart, staring at the horizon. For years, he had believed the world had stripped him bare, leaving him nothing but dust and ghosts. Yet here he was, shoulder to shoulder with those he once hated, alive because of them, alive because he had chosen not to close his door. The Apache leader approached, Scar catching the new sun. He placed a hand on Nathan's shoulder, the gesture simple, steady. His words were few, but they carried the weight of truth. "You are not alone anymore." Nathan nodded, throat thick. He watched as they gathered their things, preparing to ride. The boy he had tended sat upright now, fever broken, eyes clearer. Nathan's chest tightened with something he had not felt in years, hope, sharp and unfamiliar. They mounted their horses, 10 shadows against the morning blaze. He stood by the graves, rifle at his side, and watched them go. The desert wind stirred again, but it no longer sounded like loneliness. It carried instead the faint echo of voices, of footsteps that would remain with him long after the riders vanished into the horizon. He turned back toward his house, the land scarred but alive, and felt the weight of choice settle into him. For 12 years, he had believed grief was a prison. Now he understood, it had been a wall he built himself. And last night, when he opened his door, he had finally stepped beyond it. The horizon stretched wide, promising new storms, new dangers, new reckonings. But for the first time in a long time, Nathan Kearney did not dread what was coming. He had faced his ghosts. He had bled beside strangers. He had found something worth defending again. And though the wind still spoke in that old restless voice, he knew now it did not speak to him alone.